Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
I mean, how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, and welcome back. It's the Karma Koala podcast. And today we're talking to Taylor Loyden of Terrapin Legal Services, Terrapin Lawyers. She's a psychedelics lawyer, and she's from Boise, Idaho. But the firm was founded in Washington State. And she's going to tell us a little bit about what she does at the firm, what it is to be a psychedelics lawyer, and why the firm was created. Taylor, welcome to the Karma Koala podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with, I presume you went to law school. Well, you obviously went to law school. What happened after that? Did you walk into some law firm where you had to do conveyancing or something for a period of time and your head was about to explode and you saw what was happening around you? Give us a little bit of background of what, not many people describe themselves or work as psychedelics lawyers, and that as at the moment, that can mean a number of things. So how did you get where you are?
Yeah. So my journey with this actually started prior to graduation and actually prior to even starting law school. I was a backcountry guide for about 10 years, wilderness therapist, and ethnobotanist and naturalist in remote regions.
Well, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So I worked with or alongside indigenous communities, learned a lot about their wisdom, learned a lot about ethnobotany and the relationships between humans and plants, the mycelium web, forest ecology. And so I initially went to law school for environmental law. And then, COVID hits midway through. And like everyone, we were all reevaluating our lives and trying to figure out what was next. And, I realized that while environmental law is super important and
that's what I was about to jump in already is, environmental law is, 90% of lawyers should be doing it at the moment.
Yeah, it's important. We need those boots on the ground.
Because it's just a disaster if we don't have more environmental lawyers and more lawyers. I'm really big into animal lawyers at the moment, who I think people snigger at the same way they snigger at psychedelics lawyers. But I mean, unless we're going to understand the world around us and really start creating some pretty hard and fast laws to stop people killing it, it's a bit of a disaster, isn't it?
Truly. Yeah. And, I was studying environmental and tribal law, so indigenous law as well. And, had, an experience and realized that I could shift my focus a bit more to orient myself towards my personal interests and, relationship with plant medicines, and really use my skills to help move forward this transformative thing that was happening. It was peak psychedelic renaissance in 2019 or so, right? And so I started doing a bunch of research on medical containers, spiritual containers, research containers. I started reaching out to friends who were involved in the underground. I reached out to mentors. And through a series of connections, was introduced to my mentor, Pat Donahue, who founded Terrapin in 22. And at the time, I was really heavily focused on spiritual use, just noticing that, this intersection of the Controlled Substances Act, ayahuasca churches in particular, and the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and was just noticing that there was a problem with how all of these laws were intersecting, and there was no clear guidance.
And it seems to me that there's a certain sector of individuals and part of the economy that wants to turn that into a business rather than a spiritual, led by people who are actually been doing it for generation upon generation, generation.
Absolutely. And, we do live, those of us, particularly in the US, in this capitalistic society, right? This Western lens, but you can't.
I didn't know. I grew up in the UK knowing or being told that I lived in a capitalist society, but I really had no idea what capitalism was until I got off the aeroplane at when I was in my early 20s at JFK. And literally, I had this light bulb moment. I hadn't even left the airport, and I went, "Ah, this is what
Ah,
this
this is what it is. Modification,
Yeah,
appropriation.
yeah,
And that's not
exactly.
everybody, right? But
I know.
you know, you have these people who genuinely have been practicing with these sacraments for generations, and it comes with a long lineage of songs and learning and belief systems and cultural aspects that the US does not, as a general statement, the US doesn't have those structures. Now, we do have organizations operating in the US that have deep connections to the Shipibo people and to various indigenous communities, and who have permission and who have learned and are operating in a way that is incredibly in alignment, particularly with ayahuasca, and not going the commodification route as opposed to, the money mill retreat center style. And there's this difficulty because, we do need to make money. We do have to pay our bills, right? Mortgages, phone bills, kids, whatnot. But there's a balance that is happening. It's been happening, and we're really seeing it, where how do we support ourselves while also remaining true to these sacraments and the meaning and the depth of spiritual beliefs behind them?
So, what jurisdictions are you working in? Are you working just within the US, or are you working also within Central and South American jurisdictions to try and understand if and what they've done about these particular ways of practice and how they're managed? And then I suppose my second question is, how do you, in this work, how are you connecting two different sets of laws? Do you talk to the legislator, or are you just trying to work through the courts? How's it working?
Yeah. So to your first question about working with other countries, I haven't so much worked with other countries. I do consult with communities and organizations in, Central and South America, usually through and with my clients for various reasons. It could be securing visas or things like that for
Yeah.
shamans and practitioners. But there hasn't been so much of a cross-discipline approach. I think there's a lot of room for international law to be brought in. The US doesn't like to respect international law quite so much.
Well,
But
especially at the
you look at,
moment, it's off the books, isn't it?
we are off the tracks
Yeah.
entirely.
Yeah.
Um, and so mostly I work within the US in Washington State and at the federal level, which is, primarily RFRA and constitutional stuff. And to your second question, can you clarify that one just a little bit?
Well, so if you're helping indigenous communities and people who have done these practices, and I presume they have an oral legal system, and then you're working on the other side of placing that within the strictures of the US legal system, there's words, there's policy, there's
Yeah.
legislature, there's the courts, and there's all those sorts of words and systems. How do you work to bring those together to create the best possible solution for your clients?
Oh man, you are asking a question that I have been working with for years. So there's there's nuance. There's so much nuance. And when we look at the US legal system, the US legal system needs things to be in a box. It needs to check elements. It needs to compare apples to apples or oranges to apples, right? It needs something, it needs contrast, and it needs likeness. And what's with religious law, so primarily I work under RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which requires that practitioners have a sincere religious belief that is substantially burdened by the government. And then the burden shifts to the government to prove that it has a compelling interest in denying, in this case, the use of the sacrament or medicine. And the two primary arguments they're putting forth are public health and safety and diversion. And then the government has to prove that it's preventing the use in the least restrictive means. Now, going back to your question, entheogenic plant medicine, psychedelic spirituality is not generally considered to be religious by those of us who have relationships with these medicines. And it's more of a spiritual thing. And part of my job
we're now talking about the definitions of religion and how humankind, etc., which is a until the end of time conversation. So I mean, how you box that's what I'm interested in, because you don't, in order to work with state and federal authorities, you have to put things in boxes, don't you?
So a lot of what I do is I help clients organize and occasionally translate certain things. So certain parts of my job are pretty easy, right? The compelling interest, public health and safety. Okay, we need informed consent. We need medical intake. We need
the box stuff.
we need the box stuff, diversion. We need to have security protocols. But when it comes to the sincere religious belief aspect, part of my job is translating the spirituality aspect into something the law can understand. And that can be challenging because a lawyer has no role in saying what a spiritual belief is or is not, nor does the law. But there are certain things that we can do to help them kind of craft that. For example, there was a case maybe 10 years ago where it actually got further than most religious cannabis psychedelic cases did. And this is actually probably 20 years ago. This is well before the movement got started, as it is in the US now. And the government went through and analyzed what this guy was saying his beliefs were. And, one of the phrases was, cannabis makes me a better person. And the court said, that's not a spiritual belief. That is not a religious belief. And so part of what I do is help craft certain things like, hey, this is beautiful and amazing and true. And also it might not hold up under the law. So let's go deeper. So a lot of what I do is encouraging them to go deeper. What is the core of your belief? What do you really believe? And, sometimes that comes through prompting. It'll come through asking deeper questions. And from there, we work, the things that come out are just so astoundingly beautiful, right? It is an incredible honor to be able to support them in this. And then they craft what their beliefs are. And, I help.
And I presume it intersects with all other aspects of the way they think about the laws that control and manage their communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
absolutely.
So when you take that to a court, do they understand those concepts yet?
So it depends on the court. It depends on where you are at. If you are in Arkansas, it might look quite different than if you're in California, right? Does the state have precedent on it? And so one of the things that I do is I take a look at everything. I am, I look at every procedure, protocol, system that they have in place. And then I work backwards as if I was the prosecutor. So if I was a prosecutor saying, okay, this church is liable for X, Y, and Z, what are the things that I would want to craft my argument around? And so as an attorney for my clients, by going backwards, we just slowly take away the thing.
Walk a mile in my shoes sort of approach.
And part of what this is it's not, a manipulation of any sort. What it is helping create really safe containers. Because if legal liability is present, if you are in the courts, unless it's, something from, border, getting your sacrament taken at the border, but like, let's say a member or a client is suing you. If that's happening, harm is also present, right? Because generally speaking, nobody is going that far just because of a minor grudge, we hope. And so part of what I do is help help create systems so that harm is not occurring. And it merges, risk management, liability, negligence, RFRA, all of these different laws. It kind of gets merged into what I do is like create systems for my clients to make sure that their containers are as safe as possible.
And when you're doing work for your clients, are your clients wanting to work with you because they're looking to work with people outside their communities, or they want safer management under US federal law for their own communities, not to have their practices dissolved or destroyed?
I think it's a mix of everything. I think the number one reason why people come to attorneys is because they want to know how to protect themselves from liability, right? A lot of these people have assets or they have families, kids, things like that, and they want to know what they can do to protect themselves. And so part of that is creating safe, structures that are in alignment with the law. And something I found is that a lot of my really sincere clients, the ones who've been practicing for a long time, have genuine commitments to creating safe containers. I generally don't have to do a ton of work for them. They already have the systems built out. Most of what I'll end up doing is reviewing things, kind of giving a stamp of approval, making sure that nothing is likely to.
Formalizing for the
Yeah,
other side of the equation, so to speak.
yeah.
And in terms of getting your clients, is it a word of mouth thing? Essentially, you've done work for somebody somewhere, so they've told somebody else. Uh,
Yeah,
Taylor's really good at this. Let's get her on board to help us formalize our systems, so to speak.
yeah, it's a lot of word of mouth. I have a pretty extensive network of personal connections within the psychedelic ecosystem and that I support kind of that way. I recently people have been finding us through the website because I just redesigned
Yeah.
it and stuff like that. So I think for the first 2 years we were primarily word of mouth.
And in terms of Terrapin as a firm, is that all the sort of work that Terrapin does, or what other work is the firm involved in?
Yeah, so we pretty much entirely focus on psychedelics, which is rare for this area. So a lot of what we do, again, it's under we support a lot of spiritual containers, support a lot of therapists and harm reduction folk. I've also started teaching a lot of law and ethics courses and presenting at seminars. We do a good amount of grassroots advocacy, so working with organizations putting together decriminalization initiatives or statewide legislature or legislation type things. And so, yeah, almost all of our work is within psychedelics or the healing ecosystem in general.
And in our preamble, we spoke about the sort of two sides of the psychedelic law environment at the moment to simplify things, the sort of work that you do, and then the other side of the equation, which I'm going to call the RFK side, where everybody's all excited. Cannabis is boring. Now we're going to make lots of money out of psychedelics. And as I said earlier, I'm a big Huxley fan, so I think they all want to just make us soma, so we can't complain about anything. What are you seeing in terms? Are you seeing, because it's psychedelics again, it's very complicated. Are you seeing that these two will slowly intertwine over time, or are you seeing two separate paths developing, and it and in and normal Western, economic and legal thought, they never the twain shall meet?
I believe that they are so intertwined that no matter how hard people
They
try to keep them
try, they
separate,
can't untangle it. Well, I mean, I'm
you
glad you
can't
say that, but it's
you can't put psychedelics in a box. And there are a lot of individuals in the research or in the kind of more research medical models that are like, this is great for PTSD, this is great for depression, and it absolutely is. But there's a lot of practitioners who operate under very linear models and who are not incorporating holistic healing. And so with psychedelics, and this is something that I submitted letters to Congress a couple months back on they were looking at medical legalization. And I made this note. I was like, hey, you do have to be prepared for people having spiritual experiences. You don't need to be that researcher, that medical provider doesn't need to be the primary, but you do need to be prepared for and have a protocol in place for people having significant spiritual experiences, because that is part of the healing. the medical your depression is connected to a much deeper system of things inside of you than just a chemical situation, right? And so I just don't think there's any way to truly untangle them in the slightest bit, right? These are molecules that are so beyond our current understanding. And, if it is a step in the process that we create these models that think that they're separate, they're not going to be for long.
Yes, well, anybody who's used psychedelics to any extent in their life, well, that isn't that one of the first things you learn within the first 20 minutes of your first experience?
Yeah.
That's why you choose normally to do it again a few more times, is because you want to explore that and realize that the interconnections within life, nature, human existence with the rest of the planet existence is all entwined. So I suppose we can see something happening in Washington and in let's call it psychedelic corporate world. How do you see that unfolding over the life of this administration, which then opens up another can of worms? But do you think they will try and do you think they will be trying to create specific medicines using pharmaceuticals to treat, as you said, specific problems? Do you think that will actually happen? Because every time I have this conversation with cannabis now, they're all bored of it. They don't want to, there's a bit of money and tax for the states. Just let them get on with it. But we're not going to do anything else with it otherwise. But it seems to me there is, I don't know. I don't understand why, but there's more political capital in psychedelics at the moment, and
Mm,
people want to get things done, whatever that means, because I don't really understand what that means.
yeah, I don't quite either. Um,
I
you
think
know,
again, if you work and have used psychedelics, you don't understand it, but if you haven't used psychedelics, you do understand it
yeah,
in terms of the way of that thinking. So
there's
that's
the crux,
and with
isn't
the
it?
law, this is a really complicated set of moving parts, and that's what I'm trying to, somebody like yourself who's involved, from the moment you get up to the moment you go to bed, probably do a lot more thinking about it than I have time for.
There's, I think that the people putting forth the purely medical rigid models, I think that their intentions are in the right place. I think their intention is for healing. And to be totally honest, there are populations where they're not going to go sit in a yurt in, Peru and vomit their brains out,
I'm
right?
glad you say
I
that.
think,
You
right?
are from Boise, Idaho, so I'm glad that we had that. Because sometimes when you speak to Californians, they think that everybody's going to do that.
Yeah. And so I think that they're going this route, looking at taking the trip out of psychedelics and having this purely medical model as and trying to follow this pharmaceutical model for things because that's what they know, but they're not necessarily addressing the deeper nature of it. And while that's happening right now, I don't see that as being a forever thing because just like the psychedelics won the war on drugs, like they're gonna leave the container, they're going to leave the medical container. And so I think it kind of in the corporate world, people who are like, oh, money, there's so much money to be made and yada yada, and that's kind of that kind of bursted a few years ago. But I think that there's people in it doing it that way, and I don't necessarily, my hope is that there's enough of us putting forward genuine intention, putting for, using our unique sets of skills to make this better, that we create enough of a precedent that in time, there's this cultural shift towards respect and reciprocity and understanding that healing is holistic rather than just going to CBT therapy once a week, right? It's, it encompasses so much more. And so what I'm seeing is that you have these individuals who are, I think, genuinely interested in healing and whatnot, but are not necessarily integrating the deeper nature.
Now, we've only got a few minutes left. I've got one more question. Do you think, as a psychedelics lawyer, and you are the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg of lawyers at the moment, that the further introduction of psychedelics into society will change the way that we can think about law?
Entirely. That is my hope. And I think it's going to be slow, and I think it's going to be
Well,
painful,
that's a
and I
good
think
thing, probably, but
and I think it'll probably happen after my time because of how glacial the
yeah.
process is with law in the US. But I do think very genuinely that psychedelics are and healing and safe containers, because psychedelics are just the tool, right? The true healing is not just the medicine, it's the containers, it's the songs, it is the integration process. I think that as this becomes bigger, broader, and more accepted, and we're already seeing that in a lot of ways, society is going to change and the law is going to have to catch up. And it's slowly catching up. It's like the DEA is making really slow movements, glacial increments forward, but it is happening. And it requires each of us continuing to push that in a safe, responsible, ethical, and aligned way.
Taylor, thank you very much for sort of talking to us about your work, the firm's work, but also psychedelics and the legal system in the US, because I've had a few conversations and they've all ended in the same way that, psychedelics is another tool for creating a way for the law to think of itself in a different way and maybe come closer to indigenous legal systems that we only know 0.01% of at the moment, because they're far too bright to give us all their knowledge.